Yellowstone National Park has over half of the world's geysers, and most of them are located in the upper geyser basin. This remarkable 1 square mile area contains at least 150 of these hydrothermal wonders, making it the most densely concentrated geyser region in the world. 3 major geysers, Grand, Castle, and Old Faithful, are located here. Each day, during the high season, thousands of visitors walk from the parking lot to the circular boardwalk to experience an Old Faithful eruption for themselves. Their anticipation is palpable, as there are many false starts.
Old Faithful's rather predictable, which is unusual. Possibly its plumbing system is segregated from other active features. A lot of the underground plumbing, the cracks and fissures that plumb individual geysers are connected to each other. So if you have one that has no regular pattern, it can affect the pattern of the other. And perhaps Old Faithful's plumbing system is segregated from other active features, and that makes it very regular.
Located about a mile north of the Old Faithful area is Black Sand Basin. Some of the most colorful hydrothermal features in the park abound here. Originally, it was called the Emerald Group because of the amazing jewel-like hot springs on display here. But its name changed when tourists began calling it Black Sand Basin because of the small fragments of obsidian sand that covers portions of the basin. A beautifully placed network of boardwalks takes the visitors up close and personal with its plethora of hot springs and geysers. Emerald Pool is the most colorful and famous of Black Sand Basin's features. The clear water reflects the blues, but absorbs the other hues of the color spectrum. And the combination produces its deep emerald green color. The stunning outer ring is a fringe of yellow and orange. Here it's much lower temperature, 154.6 degrees Fahrenheit, has allowed yellow bacteria and algae to grow on the lining of the pool. Opalescent Pool is a cooler thermal pool. Early in its history, Opalescent was a boiling spring, surrounded by smaller springs. However, by the early 1950s, it was nearly a dry pool. Then Spouter Geyser began erupting, and its runoff brought Opalescent Pool back to life. Constantly bubbling, Cliff Geyser is named for its cliff-like wall of geyserite formed around the crater, and for its location on the edge of Iron Spring Creek. This geyser, like most geysers in the park, is irregular in its eruptions. Interestingly, when the geyser is active, there are usually 1 or 2 eruptions a day. But there are also periods of dormancy lasting weeks and even years. There are a couple of aptly named little geyser pools that constantly bubble and spew to the delight of visitors. The river running through this area is Iron Spring Creek. It is as colorful as the hot springs. Indeed, like so many of the thermal areas, the hot waters eventually end up in one of the rivers or creeks, creating glorious mystical experiences. North of Black Sand Basin is Midway Geyser Basin, the basin that contains the Grand Prismatic Pool. English short story writer Rudyard Kipling, who visited Yellowstone in 1889, immortalized this basin by referring to it as Hell's Half Acre. Even today, it is still remembered by that name. Despite its small size, Midway possesses two of the largest hot springs in the world. Grand Prismatic Spring, nearly 370 feet in diameter, sits upon a large mound surrounded by small step-like terraces.
The hot springs, when you come to Yellowstone, you'll notice that they're very colorful looking. You'll often see a blue, beautiful hot spring, and around the edges you'll start to get these variety of colors. For example, Grand Prismatic is one of the biggest hot springs. It has a big, beautiful blue pool, and near the very edge is light yellow. And as the water flows away and cools, you'll start to get some pale oranges, then the darker oranges, browns, and greens. Those are little microhabitats for microorganisms. So organisms that you wouldn't even be able to see with the naked eye, you can see because there's so many of them inhabiting the different temperatures of water that are flowing out of the hot springs. Some of these microorganisms are able to withstand very hot temperatures. That pale yellow around the edge of Grand Prismatic Springs is probably in about 165 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And those organisms often that inhabit the hottest waters are often a pale yellow and feed on sulfur. So if you drive around Yellowstone and you smell that rotten egg smell, it's sulfur coming out of the hot springs and geysers. It doesn't seem very appetizing to us, but to those microorganisms, it's food. As the water cools, you start to get some of the photosynthetic organisms, so the cyanobacteria. Those organisms are able to capture energy from the sun, much like plants do, and to create their own food. And in turn, those microorganisms become part of a little miniature ecosystem. The photosynthetic bacteria might be grazed upon by ephedrid flies. They're small little black flies you'd see maybe walking around the surface of the cooler parts of the water. Sometimes you'll even see the pinkish colored egg mounds that are left behind by the ephedrid flies right inside the hot spring waters. So they're grazing on the cyanobacteria, kind of like elk graze on grass. And there's predators that wander in and out of those hot spring areas, like spiders will crawl across the water looking for the ephedrid flies, and a killdeer bird might go along and pick off the ephedrid flies and the spider.
Greeting the visitors arriving from Cody to the east is Black Dragon's Cauldron. This roiling cauldron is a relatively new feature, exploding from its subterranean lair in 1948. The area is eerily intriguing. Nearby is the famous Dragon's Mouth Spring. The rhythmic belching of steam and the flashing tongue of water give the Dragon's Mouth Spring its name. At the top of the Laurel Loop Road is one of the most beautiful thermal basins in the park. Because of the long hike, many visitors often bypass the magnificent artist paint pots. Nowhere is there such a rich conflagration of color.
My other favorite is the artist paint pots. Has the gooey blurpy mud pots, and then it also has the beautiful blue pools.
Mud pots form when hot water is limited and hydrogen sulfide gas is present. It's the gas that emits the rotten egg smell common to thermal areas. As a result of these conditions, sulfuric acid is generated, dissolving the surrounding rock into fine particles of silica and clay. They mix with what little water is there to form the seething and bubbling mud pots seen here. But it is from the high point of the trail that one can see the swirling colors of an artist's paint pot. Near the north entrance to the park and outside of the Yellowstone caldera is a remarkable thermal area. A thermal area not set in volcanic rhyolite, but in sedimentary limestone. President of Yellowstone Country Guardians and former park ranger Mike Leach leads tours of this famous thermal feature.
Welcome to the Mammoth Hot Springs here in Yellowstone National Park. This is a very historic region. The first hotel in Yellowstone National Park was actually built at the foot of the hot springs here, and it's also home to historic Fort Yellowstone. The U.S. Cavalry came to Yellowstone in August of 1886 when 50 members of Company M marched down from Fort Custer, Montana Territory with Captain Moses Harris, after being asked by the Department of the Interior to come and help facilitate the protection of Yellowstone National Park. It was features like Mammoth that were actually being degraded by many entrepreneurs and visitors who were curious about the wonders of this region. While many people think of wildlife when they have images of Yellowstone today, grizzly bears, wolves, bison, it's important to remember that the boundaries were drawn up in 1872 around Yellowstone National Park as the world's first national park in hopes of keeping all the geothermal features and scenic wonders intact. It really wasn't the purpose of Yellowstone's establishment to protect the wildlife as much as it was to protect these scenic wonders and incredible thermal features. And while certainly those down in the Norris area can argue why that is such a dynamic and extreme environment, as someone who had the opportunity to work as a ranger naturalist here in Mammoth for 7 years, I will always argue that this is one of the most dynamic geological regions on our planet. I always like to say that Yellowstone is not a place but a process, and I don't think any one thermal basin really represents that and demonstrates that more than the Mammoth Hot Springs. So here we are in the vicinity of Pallet Spring. This is certainly one of the most dynamic we have in the region. It's constantly changing. You can look up here and see some of these really unique features. We have 4 different types of thermal features in Yellowstone National Park. We have hot springs, geysers, fumaroles, and mud pots. All you're going to see here at Mammoth are the hot springs, but they're some of the most spectacular hot springs that this world has to offer. While there's over 10,000 thermal features in Yellowstone National Park, Mammoth, and in particular Pallet, is certainly one of the more well-known. So if you look up top, you'll see where the water comes out of the vent, and as that flows over, you get a feature that we like to call a pulpit, and then hanging off of that pulpit, you'll see stalactites or fluted columns, much like you'd see in a cave. And many people like to describe this as an inside-out cave that changes very rapidly. And then you'll get those unique cascading features, and when there's something trying to displace the flow of the water, like one of these trees, often you'll start to get the buildup of a terrace formation, those stair-step like wedding cake style formations that makes this area so unique. And then you'll get down into here and you'll get some of these really interesting mini terraces or scalloping effects. But let's talk a little bit about how this forms and really why this area is so dynamic. If you were to look up here at Mount Everts was once underwater approximately 60 to 120 million years ago. That this region was largely sculpted by the Absaroka volcanic period that was about 50 million years ago. But roughly 60 to 120 million years ago, there was an inland ocean here in this region. And when that ocean receded, it left fossils, shells, and crustaceans that formed a layer of limestone over 1,000 feet thick. We're sitting on a hot spot here in Yellowstone. And the definition of a hot spot is a plume of magma very close to the Earth's surface. Where most people throughout North America live, that magma will be 21 to 50 miles beneath the Earth's surface. Here it's 3 to 7 miles beneath the Earth's surface, beneath the crust. And so that's what creates all this dynamic thermal activity here. We have a lot of snow. You can see anytime you visit Yellowstone, it's smart to bring an umbrella and some rain gear and certainly some warm clothes, because we're at over 6,500 feet in elevation right now, and much of the Yellowstone Plateau is at over 7,000 feet in elevation, and so the weather can change drastically. But we have a lot of snowfall. In fact, we're sitting at about 226% of our annual snowfall in the upper Yellowstone River drainage. And while most of that snow will work its way into the river systems, and we'll get spring runoff, and we'll have this scouring effect of this region's most powerful erosive process, which is the water, the rivers coursing throughout this region. Some of that will work its way to the groundwater. So in this region, where you have the several most likely streams and channels working their way through the limestone, that water is heated up by the magma. And when that magma heats the water wants to rise. But not only does the magma send up heat, but it also sends up gases. And the most important of the gases in the Mammoth region is carbon dioxide. Because when the carbon dioxide mixes with the water, it forms a weak acidic solution, a carbonic acid. So now as the water's rising through the cracks and fissures in the limestone, it's eating away at that limestone and carrying it in solution form until it reaches the Earth's surface. If you were to walk up to the vent here at any of these springs like Hyman or Pallet Spring, you would see what looks like boiling water. The boiling temperature at this elevation is approximately 199 degrees. The higher in elevation, the lower the temperature in terms of your boiling point. So what you're seeing up there is actually gases being released. You'll smell a little of that hydrogen sulfide. We certainly don't have the concentration of hydrogen sulfide you'd see throughout some of the other thermal areas, the geyser basins, where they have a compact sinter, where rhyolite is the bedrock. Thus a presence of sulfur and hydrogen sulfide, but the carbon dioxide is released. Once the carbon dioxide is released, the bond is broken, and the water can no longer hold the limestone in solution form, and thus it precipitates out. So wherever you see water flowing here, it's actively precipitating limestone. We used to say that we could see a growth of about 8 to 12 inches in a one-year time period, but in my last year rangering here in 2007, we documented a growth at Pallet Spring of over a meter. And so that's one of the things that makes this region so dynamic. As this continues to grow, it can either cap itself off or plug its own plumbing system. And since this water is all coming from one source and looking for the path of least resistance, if it can't come out at a spring where it's come out in some cases for decades, it'll come out somewhere else. So we're always asked here at the Mammoth Hot Springs, why are the springs drying up? Because people remember springs like Minerva Terrace, and when it was in its heyday, it looked like this whole hill was active. But we believe the water level stays relatively constant in this region. It's just always changing. And so when you visit the Mammoth Hot Springs, take some pictures of some of these springs that are very dynamic and active now, because when you come back 20, 25 years from now, when you come back 3 months from now, it could be dry. A dry area could be active. This was an area that was never active during my time from 2002 to 2007 working as a ranger up here. And so it just speaks to the dynamic nature of the Mammoth Hot Springs. The colors here are quite unique. When you travel around Yellowstone National Park and you visit the thermal areas, most of the colors you're going to see is similar to what you see here at Mammoth, but you'll also see a lot of iron oxides and minerals. The mineral here is calcium carbonate, or travertine. It's deposited limestone. That's the white and gray stuff. The gray stuff is the weathered limestone. But all the colors you're seeing here, the yellows, the oranges, the greens, they're what we call thermophiles. They're thermophilic, meaning heat-loving microorganisms, primarily bacteria and algae, that need the heat and need the water to survive. And so you can see a lot about the dynamic nature of this region by looking at the colors, because typically the hotter the water, the lighter the colors. You can see the main runoff channels there are white. There's most likely organisms living in that water, but they're so microscopic we're not seeing their pigments. And then the further you get from that, you'll start to get into some of these darker colors, the algaes, the browns, the greens. Another thing that's really dynamic about this mammoth area is you can look at an area like you see right up here to the left where there's no water flowing but there's color. If there's stark white rock with no water flowing, that typically tells you that there's been water flowing sometime in the last year to year and a half, because after about a year and a half the rock will begin to weather and turn gray. But if you see colors, what you're looking at there essentially are dead or dying thermophiles, because they need the heat, they need the water's not flowing there, and so you're looking at their pigment. And if you see that pigment and it's bright, that can tell you that there's been water flowing sometime, most likely in the last 2 weeks. And so, you know, even as an amateur naturalist, you can come here to Yellowstone, visit the Mammoth Hot Springs, and certainly begin to experience the wonders of this incredibly dynamic area. And it really speaks to the enigmatic and mysterious heart of this wild landscape.
Hi, I'm Bill Ambrose. If you like this video, subscribe so we can bring you more programming from our studio. Thank you for subscribing.